Okay, we have a nice amount of people in here, so I'm going to stop screen sharing for a little bit so we can introduce ourselves. So I'll go first. I'm Kamari Patrick, and I'm a co-lead for the mobile and front-end track. We are currently transitioning from the previous mobile and front-end track leads. So if you're familiar with the track and are aware of Jennifer and Mackenzie, I will be one half of the people taking it over. And in terms of where I lie in the landscape of technology, I'm pretty much all across the board, but professionally, I am a technical product manager and currently doing that freelance. And I'll throw it over to MK and then we'll start sharing.
Hi everyone, my name is MK Colmer. Thanks for being here. Thanks Kamari for that introduction as well. Yes, so I'm co-leading with Kamari, leadership fellow. Very excited to be here at Women Who Code. And then on top of that, I am currently a lead engineer at Booz Allen Hamilton, which is a consulting firm, mainly in the government space. And I've spent most of my career building out large-scale applications, back-end Java developer. And I previously was Scrum Mastering and held that certification as well. And we'll be talking about that here today. But yes, welcome everyone, and we're really excited to be here and be putting this on for you guys.
Cool. Well, I'm going to share my screen now and we will get into it. I'll ask you for checking purposes, MK. Am I sharing? Can you see?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay. So we are here to talk about Agile, particularly Agile level set and level up. And what we mean by that is, Agile is a term that's thrown around very, very loosely nowadays, and we want to level set on what those foundational principles are, and then we want to offer you some tools to level up with the project management tools you're using. So I've already introduced myself, but I did see I forgot some things. So I have a PMI ACP certification, which is an Agile certified practitioner. It's the same certifying body that releases the more known PMP, project management professional, and that certification is focused on the full broad range of frameworks that exist under the Agile umbrella. So we'll talk about some of those today. Oh, there's your picture.
Yep, yep. As I said, I'm newly a leadership fellow. Kamari and I are taking over the mobile and front end track. And I'm also a lead engineer and certified Scrum Master and a bit of AWS experience as well.
Great.
Yep, so bringing it into, if those are not familiar with what Women Who Code is all about, our mission is to inspire women to excel in their technology careers. And that is across all the way from developer to executives as well. And you can switch the slide. And then our vision is really a world where women are represented as I said, all the way from developers to technical executives, founders, VCs, board members, and software engineers. So welcome everyone.
Great. And getting into our code of conduct, so Women Who Code as a nonprofit, wants to foster an inclusive community. And in doing so, we, don't discriminate based on gender, gender identity, expression, sexual orientation, ability, physical appearance. All of this is, listed here on the slide. But I definitely want to highlight that, the community is inclusive and open to everyone. And additionally, our events are intended to inspire women to excel in technology careers, and anyone who is there for that purpose is welcome. So, even if you don't identify as women, but you are here for the mission of Women Who Code, we welcome you to these events. So thank you everyone for being here. And if you want to read the code of conduct in full, once we provide these slides in the Slack channel, you can click here and you'll be able to read that in full. Now, moving into our target audience, let me get my mouse correct here. We typically are targeting engineers with 2+ years of experience who are looking for support and resources to strengthen their influence and level up in their careers. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't welcome, junior developers as well, those who are just getting started, or those who are, not already well acquainted with code and just beginning their journey of learning about that. It's just a lot of our talks are more targeted towards that group, but we really do exist across the spectrum. So again, highlighting that idea of inclusivity, that we're here for everyone. And now let's get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so as we go through this, we definitely want to talk about what is Agile, right, and the difference between Agile and Waterfall, and I think that kind of helps everyone understand a piece of what Agile is. Different roles within Agile. I've both been an Agile developer as well as an Agile Scrum Master, so kind of tips there on my end, as well as achieving that certification for those interested. And then we'll complete our talk with Kamari, who's going to give a demo on some PM tools, JIRA, Basecamp, and Asana. That being said, we definitely want to include everyone to ask questions, encourage everyone to ask questions throughout the talk. We're not necessarily like a formal Q&A session. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll incorporate them and weed them in and out of our conversation as well. Yeah, so that being said, I guess I'd be curious, kind of the target audience here. What is everyone's like level of experience with Agile? Would you consider yourself a developer? Are you Scrum Masters? I'm curious about the demographic, if everyone kind of wants to drop in the chat, or are they really just here to like generally learn about Agile? But yeah, feel free to drop that information in the chat as we go along. Otherwise, I'll get going on the Agile Manifesto.
And I'll keep an eye on the chat while MK is presenting. So again, feel free to keep dropping questions and anything about your current Agile experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I guess I'll start with the first day I started as a software developer in my job. We started with sprint planning. And I did not even know what Agile was. I didn't even really know what software development was. So I was completely overwhelmed. So I'm hoping that, you know, some of these words, buzzwords, and different vocabulary surrounding Agile will all give you an opportunity to kind of level up if you are in an Agile situation and you're not necessarily sure what all of the vocabulary is. But first and foremost, the Agile Manifesto, really what Agile is all about is individuals and interactions. There's a huge emphasis on teams and your team dynamics and communication, as opposed to just like information silos or individual workflows as well. It's also mainly about working software that is test-driven development. You want to bring in the minimum viable product is another term you'll probably hear a lot, and have that code working as well as that application working as opposed to, comprehensive documentation. Another piece of Agile is customer collaboration. And you'll see this kind of in the difference between Agile versus Waterfall. A huge piece of what Agile is founded on is your customers are constantly engaged, and a piece of, honestly, your software development lifecycle. And the biggest point of Agile is responding to change over necessarily following a plan. And that is, how do you be more agile? And that's kind of what we're here to talk about, and having that framework to constantly evolve and change as you're creating your software. That as opposed to following like a long drawn out plan. But yeah, so I think one of the biggest things I learned in Agile to understand Agile is to understand the difference between Agile versus Waterfall. And it kind of goes back to those main manifesto and those main principles. In typical like I would call it old fashioned software development, you have this Waterfall, this concept of Waterfall. And what is Waterfall? It's this idea that you gather all the requirements up front, and for the entire application or whatever product you're developing, then you go through this massive design phase, then you go through implementation, and at the end you test it. Now you're like, okay, that sounds like it makes sense logically in my head, but I'll give you kind of an example. Like the project I'm working on is a 5-year-long contract with the government to develop a data science application tool, right? Now, if we were to have gathered those requirements up front 5 years ago and spent a year gathering requirements, a year designing, 3 years or 2 years implementing, and 1 year testing, the application would not necessarily look like what it looks like now. And that's that piece, in my opinion, of what that Agile customer focus is, right? So as you're working in Agile, your production of your software, right, and you have your user pool, and your users are constantly giving feedback, as well as your POs are giving feedback, and you're incorporating that feedback into different features that you apply to that you plan to implement, and you are gathering requirements continuously, not necessarily crazy up front and then all the way to the end product. You're continuously asking for requirements, you're continuously planning, you're continuously designing and developing and testing and releasing. And it's more of a, as you can see in this picture, a cycle as opposed to just a waterfall development. So that was a huge piece for me, learning like what Agile was, is like, what's the difference? What other ways is there to develop software? And that's waterfall versus Agile. And then so many more companies and whatnot are like, we got to be Agile, but what does that look like? And that's kind of what we're here to demystify for you guys here today. But yeah, kind of going back to that core principles of Agile. Adaptability, as I've said, it's your ability to change that design or architecture requirements. It's not necessarily like I developed something for 2 years and now the customer wants to change it and it's too difficult to change. You're like continuously developing in increments such that you're able to adapt quickly. And that's kind of the let's be agile, is let's always be moving and adaptive in how we develop our software. Another piece is this customer involvement, as I had talking about. You're constantly working with your customers and the development team, and you're maintaining, it's a relationship really. We talk to our customers about, you know, what they want to see in their application, and it's an ongoing discussion. Like every week we try to figure out what they want and then move that through technical requirements all the way through development and testing. And that kind of plays into this lean development, this concept that end product is as simple as possible. You're not trying to do something crazy complex that will take forever to do. You're like trying to develop a minimum viable product. So that like definition of what is done, you have to figure that out first. And you want to deliver that product as simple as possible. Huge emphasis on teamwork. You can't get anywhere in Agile if you're not working as a team. And that team being that incorporates your customer, and that incorporates your users, and that incorporates your dev team and your Scrum Master. And if you think of yourself as all in this one team to develop your product, you'll have a much easier time adjusting and being adaptive as your Agile project goes along. Time is very important. They're called sprints if people are not as familiar, and that is how Agile, the evolution of Agile and your life cycle, you break it up into different sprints. Typically you kind of see 2-week-long sprints. Sometimes you'll see month-long sprints. They argue that, you know, if it's more than a month long, it's not necessarily a sprint. And I say those Agile enthusiasts argue that. And the next big point is sustainability. And this kind of comes into, as you're a developer or Scrum Master, sustainability means you're actually continuously assessing, in my mind, it's assessing risks and level of effort, estimates on when you're building that software. So you know, going into building that software, building those, you know, whether or not it's 12 lines of code or 1,000 lines of code, you know that level of effort and you know the risk involved in doing that, and that will just make yourself a more sustainable developer, as well as a more sustainable Agile project. And testing, you'll constantly hear, if you're a developer, test-driven development, what does that mean? And test-driven development, I'll get into a little bit more about like with that being an Agile developer, but like I showed you, that difference between waterfall versus Agile, you're testing continuously, you're testing every sprint. So that goes back to this lean development, that simple product. You're delivering that product at the end of the sprint, and it's also been tested. So those are kind of the core principle of Agile, as you'll probably see in either trainings or online. And another piece of some of this vocabulary, right? Scrum Master. What is a Scrum Master? A Scrum Master is a facilitator, and I'll go into that a little bit more in detail. You have your Scrum Masters, you have your POs, your product owners, you have your stakeholders, your dev team, and your users. And this concept of teamwork, these people are all on your team in Agile, right? Your Scrum Master is your team facilitator. Your PO is helping drive those requirements. The stakeholders are the actual business value to the product or development. The development team are for any of you guys who are developers working with JIRA. You're a developer on an Agile team technically. And who's your end user? But again, these are the different roles in Agile. And the biggest piece of advice I would have to say is you're all on one team in the end of the day. Yeah, so Agile developers, what does an Agile developer look like? And some of this is taken online, some of this is taken from my certification course, some of this are just tidbits that I would like to add in, some personal anecdotes here. But Agile developers self-organize. And they also, in self-organizing, they also give other members on their team an opportunity to pick up new skills. And that kind of goes into this other point here. An Agile developer is not a heroic, and they do not, try to create knowledge silos on whatever they're building. And that goes back to the sustainable development. What does that actually look like? An Agile developer, you should be able to pass your feature or your code over to another developer on your team and give that opportunity to another member to be able to be very knowledgeable about the code, but also how the technology works, right? And that's that no heroics, no knowledge silos here. It is honestly very, very scary if you have a piece of software or a microservice that only one developer on your project knows about and knows how the code works. That is definitely a flaw within how sometimes people develop technology. And the idea of being agile is you should be able to honestly pass it off to another developer on your team, and they should be able to pick it right back up. And that's that sustainable development piece. And that comes in with also, like I said, good estimation, effective branching strategies for managing code, automated testing to protect the quality, and that sustainability is continuous deployment and continuous integration. As an Agile developer, if you're continually assessing, the risk and level of effort involved, as well as the impact to the overall project, you are being a more sustainable developer. And if you're communicating those risks and raising those risks, that is also helping your team set yourself up to succeed. An Agile developer, that typical, we have our massive headphones on, right? And we're coders. Everyone has that perception of what a technology or a developer looks like. An Agile developer looks totally different. An Agile developer, you are building relationships with your product manager, your Scrum Master, the design team, the QA team, and whether or not you're in a massive, large-scale project that has all these different roles or whatnot, it's based on relationships. And those relationships really start with your other peers, your other developers, and your Scrum Master, and it evolves into larger project management relationships as well with users and your POs. A huge piece that I kind of wanted to bring in was this T-shaped software developer. I don't know if people are familiar with what that necessarily is, but these building of relationships with people not just on your dev team kind of brings in this T-shaped idea that you have a curiosity to broad range your skills, right, while also developing a very niche skill set. So I'll explain kind of what I mean by that in a bit. And another piece of Agile developer, advice is spreading that code base throughout the team. Like I had said earlier, it's probably one of the scariest things. We once had somebody go out on PTO on a service that he wrote, and we had realized there was a massive knowledge silo, and we had to productionize our code and get it up and running for the user, and it was broken. And there was one person who knew how to fix it. You want to avoid those situations as much as possible. And how do you do that? On my team, we do a lot of different code reviews, which not only protects the quality of the code, but it also helps to create no knowledge silos or spread familiarity with your entire dev team. And that's that sustainable development piece. Yeah, so if we want to flip to the next slide. Yeah, the Waterfall Dev versus Agile Dev. I kind of said this. When I imagine a waterfall developer, you're sitting in the cube, you got your headset on, you're isolated, and you're simply writing code. And that, honestly, that idea of what a developer it looks like now, I think is kind of, it's not as, Agile development is where we got to be, right? People want you to be self-organizing. What does that mean? You are given a task and you take it all the way through to completion. It's that sustainability piece. You go all the way from concept, which is getting those requirements and trying to figure out where does this fit in our architecture, or where in the code would I put that couple lines of code, all the way through to the end-to-end testing piece, right? There's so many different phases of that life cycle, and self-organizing means you're taking responsibility for that piece of code all the way through to when a user either has an issue with that code or, either hopefully there's not a bug in the code, but you're taking accountability and you're taking responsibility for that code. Agile developers are constantly asking for feedback from their peers, from their Scrum Masters. I think that's the biggest piece with learning on the job in software development. An Agile developer, you are peer coding, you are asking questions, you're constantly saying, how can I improve this code? Agile developers understand the definition of done. That's a big thing that I had to understand. What does it mean to be done with my task? Oftentimes I think you'll find developers will be like, yeah, like it's pretty much done, but I have to finish a little bit of things here or there. I have to finish up that unit test. Like, that's not done, right? Like, you still have to account for that work, and that it depends on your organization or your project, but like, that's not technically done, right? So understanding the definition of done and communicating effectively on that definition of done is really important. Team player, again, I've talked about this quite a bit. You're engaged with the PO, you're highly communicative, and there's this concept of a predictive approach that I like to share with people. A predictive approach means like you're predicting those risks, you're predicting how this feature is going to get implemented, you're predicting how this code's going to get implemented, you're predicting how you're going to test it, all the way end-to-end test it, as opposed to taking a backseat approach. You're like on top of it in that way, and I find that honestly minimizes risk in the project. But yeah, so those are kind of like waterfall versus agile in my opinion. And then there's this concept of T-shaped software developers, which I brought in. And this is something somebody had shared with me, like, no, your goal is to be working towards being T-shaped here, right? You're developing a depth of knowledge, whatever that technical expertise you continue to develop. But this base knowledge skills, like broadening yourself out over different areas of technology, helps you be a better T-shaped person. And if you go to the next slide, I'll kind of show you a more concrete example that I actually just got off the internet. What does this actually look like? So if you're in a massive large-scale project, or you're in a company, you have an analyst, a programmer, a test engineer, web designer, system engineer, right? All of you guys have different jobs. That's why they have different job titles. However, and your like example is a test engineer, like you want to develop that deep level of expertise within your role, but it will really help you out in the long run if you have an idea of how the programmer finishes their unit tests, or you have an idea of how the web designer takes, UI UX design, takes technical requirements and creates UI UX design. I found in my own career, taking an interest in DevOps and kind of cloud stuff has really broadened my range of understanding how our application is deployed. And it helps like broaden my knowledge, right, of growing like more T-shaped software, as opposed to just like staying very deep and Java focused as I have in the last couple of years. So that's just something I'd like to share with everyone, is like working towards being a more T-shaped software developer. I think it might help you with the Agile developer piece as well. But yeah, so I guess developer advice, kind of, I've already gone into this a bit. Just understand what it means to be agile, understand that purpose. You're all here on this call right now, you are already doing that. So you guys already have number one done. Number two, ask your Scrum Master questions about agile best practices. Technically as Scrum Master, you are supposed to be an agile enthusiast. You're supposed to be bringing those agile methodologies and practices to whatever organization you are in. And I'll get into that in a bit. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from my advice working as an Agile developer is understand your company and organization's version of Agile or definition of done. And I think for anyone on this call, I'm sure Kamari, you could probably speak to it. Everyone's definition of Agile and how they use Agile is different, right? And that's not to say one is wrong or one is right. Everyone has different adaptations to that. But it wasn't until I got like formal Scrum Master certification training that I understood what like technically Agile is by the book, and how my company was doing it a bit different. And that'll help you understand like workflows and how you can be a better developer in that way. Self-organize, take ownership of your code, from spiking it out to all the way productionizing it and supporting users. T-shaped software developer, well-rounded, open-minded. Look up is my biggest piece of advice. Look up and ask questions. And grooming the backlog is something, and it's a take that we do in my company's Agile, but anytime people would be like, oh, like I saw this thing in the code, like it looks pretty weird, we should probably look into it. I'm like, write a ticket for it, add it to JIRA, let's not forget it. Think of JIRA, at least for me, as like my constant list of like to-dos and different work I can do. And Scrum is a big thing, like learning how to, communicate in Scrum. A lot of people just are like giving status updates, and really Scrum is for briefing risks or impediments on top of having a status update. But yeah, so that's kind of my Agile developer advice. I don't know if there's specific questions here, but before I go into Scrum Mastering, my take on Scrum Mastering. Does anyone have like developer questions more geared towards kind of all of that? I know I just kind of talked really a lot for the last 20 minutes.
I'll let you know, MK, some questions have come in.
Yeah.
They are kind of across the board, so I think we can save them till the end.
Okay. Cool.
Last slide, but yeah, great questions are coming in, so everyone keep them coming. We're gonna save 15 minutes at the end to go through those.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. Yeah, so keep the questions coming. Agile Scrum Masters, what does Scrum Master look like? In my eyes, a Scrum Master is a facilitator. They unblock their developers. A Scrum Master, as they teach you in Scrum Master certification, is it's called servant leadership, right? And what does that mean? And being a Scrum Master is very selfless. You're behind the scenes. You're not necessarily involved with the product design and development. Quite frankly, you don't really have time to be quite so involved, you'll find, if you step into a Scrum Master role. And you're this piece of facilitator. Scrum Master is a facilitator, I kept telling myself when I was Scrum Mastering. And it's more about getting the right people in the room to unblock your developers, to help the POs talk to the right people. So it's a big piece of soft skills. If you do have a technical background, I thought it was really helpful to have a bit of development experience. You don't need development experience to be a Scrum Master. Like some of the best Scrum Masters I've seen have like literally never coded before. So if you're interested in Scrum Mastering and you're like, I should get technical first, that's not necessarily the case. It's a combination of soft skills and using the latest tools and methods and processes. And Kamari is going to go into this a bit more in detail. I found a lot of times as a Scrum Master, my role was to facilitate, but also bring my developers back to a broader scope. It's so easy when you're coding and you're developing to get like bogged down in the code, to like kind of put on those headphones, as I was kind of using that analogy. And I always try to bring my developers back to the whiteboard. Where does this, like, you're writing 5 lines of code, but where does this fit into the whole end to end of our product? And definitely a reminder for milestones reached and timelines. Scrum Masters, that is your job. Like, hey, we have 2 days left in the sprint, let's go, you know what I mean? So encouraging your developers to stay on target. I think the most interesting thing also is Scrum Masters are not managers. Scrum Masters are equals. By Agile and by Scrum, a Scrum Master is a team member and a facilitator. And that's really important to keep in mind. So I guess kind of go back one slide if I miss any other sort of advice.
Yeah, there we go.
Sorry. Yeah, no worries. So Scrum Master advice, get certified, really. As a Scrum Master, you're an Agile enthusiast. You're supposed to be bringing Agile engineering practices to your team. Certifications will never harm you. So, invest in yourself and then invest in your team as you bring different Agile engineering practices to your team. One of the biggest things I had to do is understand that my role as a facilitator. I think anyone who's in technical leadership or, joining us, whether or not you're a Scrum Master or you're a technical lead or you are a project manager, you have to delegate, right? Like, you have to delegate roles and responsibilities. And part of me transitioning developer to Scrum Master was, you're a facilitator, and like sometimes it's hands off. You want to empower your team to be a well-oiled machine. Somebody once told me, one of my mentors once told me, like, if you're doing the Scrum Master thing right, like, you should basically be able to say, see ya, I'm going on vacation for 2 weeks, or, like, not show up to work one day, and your team would just be a well-oiled machine and they'd know what to do. So that's an important piece of advice. The biggest thing I learned from training was the Agile coach was like, count to 3 before you speak. And I was like, huh? And, I went back after getting certified last winter, and I went back into work and I started doing that, count to 3 before you speak. And you'll notice that, like, counting to 3 before you speak is empowering your other team members to speak up, to be more communicative, empowering your developers to have a relationship with the PO, to have a relationship with the end users, to have a relationship with the testers. The more relationships you facilitate, to be honest, like, the easier I found your job was. And that was counting to 3 before you speak. You're not supposed to answer every single question. It helps to delegate and have people feel empowered to talk about what they're doing and what they're building. Another thing, assess team strengths and weaknesses. I took some time, when I took a day off after I did the certification, I spent some time assessing, like, my team and, like, strengths and weaknesses. Also had conversation with each of the developers, like, where are you stronger, where are you weaker, and then was able to kind of create, like, coding pairs, right? Like, when you're doing code reviews or code pair, like peer programming, really, you can, pull on each other's strengths and weaknesses. Another piece of Scrum Master, don't overcommit to your team or don't overcommit your team. You will definitely face over-demanding POs, stakeholders, maybe your PM. Fix this right now, like implement this right now. Agile's a methodology and a framework for a reason, and those processes are there to help you, right? Never overcommit to your team. Never commit something that your team will do without talking to your team. And that kind of also goes into, you look good? No, it's about how your Scrum team looks. That goes into that servant leadership as a Scrum Master. It's really about how your team does, and at the end of the day, that's how your role is defined. And that encouragement was another piece. Yep. So your team should be able to do your job. It's pretty funny I say that, but really it's a well-oiled machine, and giving your opportunity for your developers and your team to like facilitate and self-organize, giving them the space to do that is so important. Of course, as a Scrum Master, you're there to bring the energy. You're there to be influential. And one thing I found I started to do, which was definitely a no-no, when it got crazy busy, the last 2 days of the sprint, before the sprint ended, you're tired, never skip retro. Retro is so important to whether or not you're doing Agile or you're doing any sort of, like, in my opinion, any sort of like management. Doing some sort of retro is so important for that your developers on your team feel like there's a avenue or a space, a safe place to like share like concerns, but also like the biggest piece of advice with retro I have is, take last sprint's feedback and incorporate it into the next retro, because you want to be that energy, right? That you're building and you're moving and you're carrying your team forward. And we're learning, guys, we're learning. What's the next step? A month ago, we were complaining about this, and now look at how our co-team dynamics are doing right now, or like what processes have we implemented that have helped us. So I think retro is so important. And on top of that, tying retro in and interweaving it into your team processes is all the more important as well. But yeah, I believe my last slide is kind of on actually getting that certification. Certified Scrum Master requirements, you have to attend. It's not like some other certifications where you can kind of bypass the in-person piece. To do a Scrum Master certification, the first thing is you have to attend a live or in-person course taught by a certified Scrum trainer. I've seen all of these are typically just 2 days long. Mine was in person. I did it last February in New York. It was 2 days. And I believe all of them are online right now, but you have to sit in 2 full days of training. You can't even, they won't let you out of training early. Like, it's a minimum number of hours, those 2 days of in training, which I just looked, they're all online. And then you take the CSM exam, shortly after. I took it like 2 or 3 days after the training. And truth be told, after you do the in-person training, and as long as you're kind of engaged and listening, I probably looked at the material for another hour-ish, maybe 2 hours after that, and took the exam, and I had little to no issues at all passing the CSM exam after you sit through the training. But yeah, so kind of those logistics there. Typical cost is $1,000 to $2,000 for the course, and that includes the CSM exam fee. You can go to all different organizations, Scrum Alliance, Scrum Org, PMI. And I did Scrum Alliance, so I can only really speak to that one, but the certification, you have to do a renewal fee every 2 years. So I got it in February of 2019, so I'll have to recertify with a renewal fee, and I believe that's the only thing you really have to do. But yeah, any certification will never harm you. I got so much out of it. I definitely was so overwhelmed. I was Scrum Mastering for like 4-6 months maybe before I went into actual Scrum Master training. And I was like, wow, I really wish I had done this, before, because it actually gave me, a base of understanding and knowledge of Agile, but it also gave me so many tips, which I, have shared with all of you about being a Scrum Master. But yeah, does anyone have any questions regarding either being a developer or a Scrum Master or working on a team, or any sort of comments before we head into leveraging different tools to support these frameworks?
Yeah, if you want to answer some of those questions now, I can pick out some that are very specific to, Scrum. So let's see. Would you recommend developers and testers getting certified as a Scrum Master? And I think you touched on this, but if you want to give another.
Yeah. I don't necessarily think it's not necessary. I don't as a developer. However, what I will say though is a piece of Agile developer advice is like talk to your Scrum Master and ask those questions about Agile, because if you are on a team with a Scrum Master and they are that Agile enthusiast, I don't necessarily think you need to get. I do believe Scrum Alliance does do like Agile developer certificates as well. It will never harm you, but it necessarily, I think, I learned a lot on the job, right, of what it meant to be an Agile developer, but that information was like verified for lack of a better word, it was like verified or like more like concrete once I actually got that certification. So no, I don't think it's necessary as a developer or a tester, but again, a certification will never harm you. But being curious, open-minded, and have a desire to learn what it means to be Agile is a great place to start.
Great. And here's another one. Is it okay to be both at the same time? Both a developer and a Scrum Master?
Honestly, no. I mean, in my opinion, in my experience, it was next to impossible. One of the biggest things I struggled with when I switched moving up from a developer into a Scrum Master role, and at my company, and I had said this, like, learn what it means to be Agile. Like at my company, Scrum Masters were also kind of like a management piece as well. So when I stepped up into that role, I was still trying to code because I was like, I don't want to lose my coding skills. And it was honestly so overwhelming to like get bogged down in the details, but then also have to be a facilitator and be super high level. Quite honestly, I didn't have enough time to do both. If you do have time to do both, like hats off to you. But it kind of made me, honestly, I was pretty overwhelmed until I kind of got the certification and understood what my role was more so to be. And that is being that facilitator for your team. But you can do both. I personally would say I thought it was stressful. But
okay. Yeah. I'll throw you two more, and then everyone else that asks questions will answer those at the end. But two more that are aligned to this, what we just talked about with being a Scrum Master. How does PSM compare to CSM? So I don't know if you're aware of the PSM certification, MK, but I'm not. So
I'm not as well. Yeah.
Give us the full name of that certification, and we'll see if we just know it by another name.
Is it professional? It honestly might be the professional versus certified. Yeah, I think that's actually what that is. So CSM is like the base level, like certified Scrum Master, and then you can get professional certified, like professional Scrum Master certified, and that's next level. I haven't done that, but you definitely can. I just went for the strictly certified Scrum Master, simply because a lot of my peers that were Scrum Mastering, that's the certification they got. But I do know people who have advanced, I believe that's what that is, professional Scrum Master certification. I'm not sure the level of involvement for training, but I'm sure it's more in depth or probably more rigorous because it's the professional cert versus just the certified.
Cool. And then I'll throw you one more, and everything else we'll hit at the end. So I actually have this information up on the slide right now, but I'll still ask the question aloud to see if you have anything further to say, MK. But Scrum Master certification expires. Do you have to update it? So clearly, yes. It is different depending on your certification.
Yeah.
Whatever the design body requires.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for your questions. Keep them coming if you still have some that are left over from everything MK talked about. I'm now going to move into the next stage of our discussion, which is more focused on leveraging project management tools to support whatever Agile framework you are using for your company or your side project. So again, keep the questions coming as I go. So supporting Agile frameworks. So MK did a really great job, starting us off with Agile principles and then driving us forward to actual Scrum framework implementation. I really want to double down on the difference between those two. So Agile is a set of ideals and principles. So when we were going over the Agile Manifesto, going over all of the principles aligned to Agile, those are principles that serve as a North Star for then you to create a framework or to use an existing framework to embody those principles. So we talked about one of them extensively, Scrum. It's very widely used, very well known. And we're going to talk about another one here, Kanban. And typically, organizations will not are not properly like identifying what they're using. A lot of time they're using a combination of Kanban and Scrum. I've seen that extensively, but it's really Kanban and Scrum are the frameworks that help teams adhere to Agile principles and get stuff done. But those are two separate things. So you have Agile principles and you can use those as you see fit. Agile principles are also used in areas outside of software development. So obviously a Scrum team or a Scrum framework might not work for a construction company. I saw someone post in the chat that they came from construction and they weren't using Agile, but that doesn't mean you can't. So it's a set of principles that you can then build a framework off of. And we have some existing ones that can be referenced. So this visual here shows, Agile is an umbrella of principles under which several frameworks exist. And Scrum and Kanban I've highlighted here because those are what I have most experience in and what I've seen most prevalent through, companies that are using some combination of both. And obviously we've talked a lot about Scrum, so we'll talk a little more about Kanban. And where Kanban comes into place is definitely within the project management tools that you're using. So Kanban versus Scrum. So first thing is cadence. Scrum is a regular fixed length sprint. MK talked about that. Here it gives an example of 2 weeks, but it can be anywhere from 1 week to a month. You're going beyond that. You're kind of steering away from Agile principles, but there is that flexibility to choose a sprint cadence within that range. Kanban is meant to support continuous flow. So this means that you have a set of tasks that you're constantly just pushing towards completion. And this is where I say companies are a lot of times using Scrum and Kanban, but are still calling it Scrum. So they probably, have a fixed length sprint, but they're still allowing, perhaps continuous deployment or something along that lines. Release methodology. So Scrum, you release at the end of each sprint. So again, I've seen companies that have all of the Scrum ceremonies, the retro, but are still kind of doing continuous deployment, continuous delivery. And that's where you're getting a combination. Scrum bomb is sometimes what people say. In regards to roles, so there was a slide earlier, we talked about the roles aligned. Those are really specific to Scrum, but again, the Scrum versus Agile, Scrum a framework, Agile principles, it's really the Scrum framework that calls for those roles. Agile itself doesn't necessarily call for a Scrum Master. It calls for a development team because, of course, that's foundational to creating the software, but it doesn't necessarily call for a product owner or Scrum Master. Kanban, similar as a framework, does not require any roles. But again, companies that are using Kanban oftentimes have these roles. So they're really doing a combination. Key metrics, I'll just briefly touch on. So Scrum, velocity, how many points are you completing a sprint? That's velocity. And lead time, cycle time, work in progress. Those are all more aligned to how often, or what is the time length from a story being picked up to completion. So it's less about the number of points a sprint, more about your progress aligned to, a single story and what that averages out as. And then change philosophy. So Scrum says teams should not make changes during a sprint. Kanban says change can happen at any time. This is the area where I most see these concepts combined, because even companies that are using a Scrum framework still allow for change if needed. It's not ideal, but for instance, I've been at companies where, if some story comes through that really, we really need to get done for whatever reason, sign a new customer, we're a smaller company, we will swap stories that have the same pointed value. That's not a perfect method, but again, there is that ability It's right in the Agile principles, iterative development, change philosophy. So when you get into these frameworks, they're more specific, but that's why you can do a combination of them as long as you're still pointing to the Agile principles as your North Star. So again, just kind of reiterating on Kanban principles. Actually, I haven't said this one yet. So a big thing with Kanban is the Kanban board. So that is a board that shows you the current state of a story or a piece of work based on the column that it's in. So if you're familiar with JIRA, if you're familiar with, Trello, you'll notice that a lot of Scrum teams use Kanban boards. So that shows you, the combination is inherently there of the two, but that doesn't always translate to the language when we talk about Agile, when we talk about Scrum. Work in progress limits. So this is discouraging multitasking by limiting the number of tasks that can be in progress at a given time. That number can be specific to an individual or specific to a team. Typically it should be specific to a team, so you aren't encouraging any type of competition amongst, individuals or setting different standards, but what can the team do collectively with that combination of people? And then workflow. So this is defining your project stages. What are the columns you have on your Kanban board? Do you have a design in progress? Because sometimes you can, add that to the level of visibility as well. Or do you have the most simple, which is in progress, done. That would really be the most simple, but you probably want a column that's like not started, in progress, done. And then moving on to Scrum, what's unique to Scrum? All of the roles that we talked about, all of the ceremonies or events, the retro, the daily stand-up, grooming activities, and then your artifacts, which, you definitely don't want to create documentation for documentation's sake. That's in the Agile principles, but there are, some things that should be documented in order to keep the team moving forward. And then also this idea of writing work in defined units of work as user stories and acceptance criteria. So that falls under the artifacts bucket. And now I'm going to show some project management tools. So we will start with JIRA. So this is JIRA. If you are not familiar with it, I'll take a little time explaining things. If you are familiar, just know that this is going to probably be things that you already know. So Kanban and Scrum, you can see, are listed here as 2 template options for boards. And what's really interesting here is, I showed you that slide with all of the other frameworks underneath. And clearly, these two, it's supported by this theory that these are the most popular, is supported by, one of the leading project management software having templates for those two and kind of focusing their tool to those 2 frameworks. So first we'll create a demo Kanban board. So we'll say demo Kanban, create a key. We'll just say con, and we'll create this. And I want to call out some features of this board, and we will then take a look at the Scrum board. So with the Kanban board, you see they already have 4 columns here listed for us: backlog, selected for development, in progress, and done. So that's supporting the Kanban principle aligned to visually displaying progress of work, of units of work that have been defined. So if it's backlogged, it's not been groomed yet, like MK was saying, you have an idea, you throw it in the backlog. And then once it's actually been prioritized and selected for development, that's when you have to groom out the story and make sure all of the necessary requirements are there for it to be worked on by a developer independently when they pick it up. And then that developer will move it through the other columns based on where they are. Definition of done is really important here. That's something that exists in the background as a working agreement amongst the team. What is the definition of done? Maybe In this case, in this board, there's a whole separate team responsible for testing, and the definition of done for the developer using this board is their code has been locally tested and that's all they need to do. And then it hands off to another team. If you take a look, you will also see there are some reports here. So those key metrics that we were talking about before, JIRA goes really, beyond what's just kind of like the baseline recommendation for metrics to look at, but they also have all of those as well. So you get resolution time, you can take a look at individual user workloads. You'll notice that there aren't any burn down and burn up charts noted here. And those are probably more popular. Those actually come from the Scrum framework. So again, teams use a combination of both and don't really know that all of the time. So now I'm going to create not an issue. I'm going to make another board here. So this time we will make a Scrum board and see what looks different. Scrum demo. Okay, so noticeably different here. You'll notice that, there's less columns. So there's to do, in progress, and done. Also, there is a separate backlog column here. So say this is a sample story. And the reason for this is with the Scrum framework, you are working in a time box sprint. So you don't necessarily want line of sight to everything in the pipeline. With Kanban, you see everything in the pipeline. It's continuous deployment, continuous development. But more often than not, teams are still utilizing a kind of Kanban view. So this is, a Kanban principle using to do, in progress, done, but scoping it just to the sprint. So you need somewhere else to take a look at all of your work that isn't in a sprint. That's what the separate backlog view is for. If I create a sprint, I can put a story into the sprint. If I go back to active sprints, still nothing there, because again, from a planning perspective, you might be planning sprints 2-3 sprints out, but ultimately, what's your focus when you go to your board? Your active sprint. So going to the backlog view, if I start the sprint, and there's some parameters here, there's some flexibility, 1 week, 2 week, 3 week, 4 weeks. So again, that's within the recommended according to the Agile principles. I click start, and now I see this story here, and I can move it through. So that's JIRA. JIRA is very, popular, and this instance I have here is a free JIRA instance. So this is something you can even stand up for yourself for your side projects. Or, if your company, if you want to get more advanced in your knowledge of JIRA, you can create your own account and play around with everything in here. There are, some things that are add-on that your company probably pays for extra, but for the most part, JIRA does a really good job. Their free version gives you a lot to work with. Now I will quickly take a look at Asana. So Asana is another popular project management tool, typically more popular outside of the software development space. JIRA is kind of the main known name there, but Asana does have a really great free version as well. And what I like about Asana are their templates. So we were talking about the sprint retrospective. So this isn't necessarily an agile principle, as hosting a retrospective is, but using a board format to do so is not. But that's why I really like Asana, because they offer things that align to agile principles, but are implemented in a framework that isn't necessarily defined. So this retrospective template, I'll just take a look at this one. They have an agenda column, what went well, what didn't go well, questions. So at its most basic, that's what a retro is. Asking the group what went well, what didn't go well, creating action items off of that. So this board gives you instructions on how to do that. at the start of each meeting, clear out the cards. And it tells you how to use this board to be your retrospective, which is a really great option for remote teams that aren't all working at the same time. You might want to, not actually do a face-to-face. I would encourage face-to-face, and actually there are extended, things around how to best implement Agile for remote teams. And it does encourage, as much face-to-face as possible. There's also this concept of a fishbowl, which I don't love, which is essentially having a screen up the whole time while you're working and anyone can pop in and ask you a question. But I say that to say, there are other ways to do things if that just doesn't happen to work for your team. So I encourage people, again, to make a free Asana account, take a look at other templates. I'm not going to look at any more today, but they're all very thorough like this. There's one for the daily stand-up. There's one for grooming cards. There's one for planning cards to make a roadmap. And then finally, we'll take a look at Basecamp. So Basecamp on its own cannot be the only tool used to implement a Scrum or Kanban framework. They don't utilize boards at all. And there isn't a card system that would allow you to point cards, add an estimation to them with these tools. Instead, what Basecamp is really good for is a supplemental tool for remote teams that want to manage things like retros automatically. So this automatic check-ins feature, I really like. You can define whatever you want your questions to be and set the cadence that they're delivered to people to respond to. So you can automate your stand-up that way. You can automate your retro that way. And I really enjoy that. So with that said, I've seen lots of great questions come through. I'm going to stop sharing and put the image back on MK and I, and we're going to get to some of those. So I will grab this first one here, which is, I just saw it.
How do you deal with issues of scope creep within stories or not properly considering how the story will impact everyone's time?
That's that for, you see that? I was looking for a retro one. I remember because I wanted to start with that.
Yeah.
Oh, here it is. Do you have any tips for improving retro meetings? But we can move on to that one after.
No. Go ahead. Sorry.
Do you have any tips for improving retrospective meetings? A lot of times the team doesn't have anything to say. So my tip here is every retro meeting should start with framing the retro meeting until it becomes second, nature. And even then, I've been on mature engineering teams and I still start by saying, this is time for us to gather feedback and input so that we can iteratively improve how we do things. Agile is a set of principles, but ultimately how we implement is up to what's best suited for our team. So this retrospective is our clearest input to making those adjustments. And then from there, I like to let people know that they can skip if they want to. And if there are a lot of skips, I go around the room again. So I guess I didn't say what I do. I typically say what went well, ask everyone in the room what went well, document it, people can skip. And then I'll do another round. And, the people who said something the first time may have something separate. This works really well for teams that aren't, as communicative. If your team speaks a lot, then I would just do one round and get everything at once. But if you want to instruct people to only give one thing that went well in that first round, that really helps facilitate that. And then, you move on to the next question and do the same thing. What didn't go well? And then I like to take that what didn't go well list or what do you want to change and make action items with the group off of it. So I think that ending piece of actually taking it through to solutioning after getting everyone's feedback helps to encourage engagement. So it doesn't feel like you're just documenting for documenting's sake and, someone else is reading it behind the scenes to do what they want with it. So yeah, you can pick another question you want to take, MK.
Oh yeah, no, I was just going to piggyback off that. I noticed as we went remote, our retros got more and more quiet. And I was like, uh-oh, what's going on here? And especially with everyone working remote, I feel like honestly people need more of a platform or avenue to speak about I'm happy today or I'm not happy today and this is why. So I piggyback off your advice, actually ask the person by name. I found normally works. Or if you have somebody shy or quieter on your team, and you're kind of aware that they had a really tough sprint, just say, oh, like I noticed this, like, what's your kind of feedback on that, that situation. And generally that gives people a good like avenue to start sharing. But yeah.
Good.
How do you deal with, I know there's a bunch of different questions, and I do know we are slowly running out of time. So I don't mind saying and answering a few more of them, if that's what everyone wants. But if you do, being conscious of everybody else's time, if you do need to drop off, thank you so much for being here. And you can definitely ask us any questions via our Slack. If you're not a part of either track Slack, feel free to reach out to us on that platform. But Kamari, if you're comfortable, and we don't necessarily have.
Yeah, I'm comfortable sticking around for another 10. And yeah, like MK said, we're always available via Slack. You can ask us questions there. We will also be posting the recording there. So if you're popping off early, you can fast forward to like the last 10 minutes and more of the Q&A will be going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, scrolling back up to the top, I know there were a couple questions, just a lot around stories and how to like scope. I suppose the work is what I'm guessing. I don't know, Kamari, if you have any tips on that.
Yeah, so let's see. There was something around scoping. How do you deal with issues of scope creep within stories or not properly considering how a story will impact everyone's time? We have a problem where a story will be assigned to a specific person, but will require a lot of time from other individuals that is not always accounted for. So I think in terms of story creation, one thing that is very important is making sure it's a defined unit of work. So your question kind of leads me into thinking there are probably several steps to complete that story, in which case you should break it off into separate stories. That doesn't mean that there can't be blockers. One story can't block another, but it definitely, if you are finding a story has to be handed off, down a chain, that's probably not written in a way that is ideal and aligned to Agile principles. Should be a small unit of work. Another way to figure this out in terms of time and having issues around story time completion, after you have written a story out, get it sized. I know at my, engineering last team I was on, we didn't accept stories that were 21 points. So we used Fibonacci and, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. If it was a 21 point story, that was our sign we needed to break it off further. We just made that an epic at that point.
Yeah.
So I think, if you're finding that time is an issue, if you're finding that scope creep is an issue, make your stories smaller and try to target stories that are no larger than 8 points. And that obviously is relative to how your team sizes. But again, I like to start with a 1 is a 1-line code change. A 2 is a little more than that. A 3 is a little more than that. So let the team kind of orient themselves around that. It's not meant to be a perfect science. It's meant to be a relative comparison based on the team, and their dynamics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think piggybacking off of that, one of the things I realized when I was either Scrum Mastering or as I'm developing is if I take a look at my sprint and I'm like, I didn't have enough time to complete this task, but it looks like I didn't do, what did I do all sprint? You know what I mean? And your sprint should really reflect how you spend all your time. So in terms of like that supporting ticket, like one of the things we use at my company is it's a massive like 8 different Scrum teams, right? So like I put in support tickets for some of my software developers. If like, somebody else is developing a piece of technology and they're constantly asking you for help in meetings and whatnot, that is work, that is your time. So supporting that has definitely helped. Adding in those tickets, giving like developers an idea like, yes, part of my job this next 2 weeks is supporting this team in their development. And I thought that was helpful in terms of like tracking and not necessarily overcommitting, because sometimes there's a lot of work that you're doing behind the scenes that you need to capture in your sprint. So.
That's a really good point. A related question is there an ideal way to calculate story points, and what are your criteria for estimating and assigning story points? You want to start with that, MK?
Yeah, it's kind of difficult because where I work and you're not supposed to do points based on time. Like we say like 2 points is about like a junior developer's full day, which I know you're not supposed to do that in terms of like actual sprints and story breakdowns, but that's how I've been trained to like estimate and point estimate, and when I'm breaking down epics into features and breaking down features into story points as a technical lead, I use that frame of reference, but I know that is not generally like the whole case for everybody else. So I don't know if you can offer a different perspective there.
Yeah, I guess, I would say in terms of criteria, that I think you're kind of speaking of what's a two, so same as MK said, it's specific. The only thing that, Agile kind of offers us is that, that's going to be the sizing, it's to help plan and to ensure that a set amount of work is being put into a time box sprint. So that's all going to be relative to the team in terms of criteria. I like to use, Fibonacci, because you can actually calculate velocity if you're using a quantitative value. But I've also seen teams do t-shirt sizing. So that's extra small, small, medium, large, XL. That's a really good strategy if, you're less interested in velocity and more interested in just kind of getting a sense of time it'll take to complete a story. And then is there an ideal way to calculate story points? So what I think you mean by that is at the end, how much work was done, because otherwise, you weren't or maybe you mean assigning. So I'll say
probably scoping. I would say scoping. I don't know specifically who asked that question, but yeah, scoping.
That's what it would be. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the one thing I always told my developers is like, they're like, oh, how many points do I do? How many points do I do? I go, let's bring it back to like the big picture. Like the reason we're using Agile and whatever is like, if you severely underestimated, overestimated, you'll learn from it, A, and B, next sprint, you can pull in more stories to complete those tickets. So I always tell people don't necessarily sweat the points, especially because I think it does take time to kind of get used to however your company does Agile or however your team generally sizes. It takes time to become familiar with how to scope and then assign. Assigning, yes. Okay. Yeah, assigning. On my team, we kind of just take turns kind of running through and assigning. Back to kind of what I was saying about being an Agile developer is we work many different features in parallel, right, on my team. And we don't ever want that knowledge silo. So we kind of, make sure that we're distributing up that work on that feature between multiple developers. And I was also doing code reviews across different features. So assigning is definitely kind of it's a fun game during sprint planning. And oftentimes people who write their tickets oftentimes take their tickets and making sure that there's not necessarily creating knowledge silos when you are sprint planning.
Cool. So we'll take a couple more here. So I'll take, do you have any stories to share on impacts to the team when the PO role is not being done either consistently or not at all? So I've been a PO. I'll also say it was a very small, like we started as a 9-person engineering team that grew to 32 eventually. So when I started, I was a Scrum Master, an engineering manager, a technical product owner. Like I was doing it. I was pushing
everything. Yeah.
I was a mini developer. I was like a junior developer. So if we're talking about, a PO role in the traditional sense, a product owner should be involved and responsible for grooming stories, translating business requirements to technical requirements, and unblocking any impediments on those cards as engineers work on them. So if a role is not being done consistently or at all, in general, that's what the retro is for. So blanket feedback is highlight that in the retro, and there are ways to do that without calling out the person. What are the actual tasks aligned to that PO's role? So if we're talking about, traditional, in the traditional sense, you can say stories are coming in not groomed. Like I can't work on a story that isn't groomed. And you can say, the requirements are changing over, the course of the sprint. So those are things where the action items are inherently going to go back to the role responsible for doing those things. So I always say utilize your retro to call out not people, but vacancies in the actual work that you are seeing is being completed. And MK, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I smiled when you read that question because I've definitely been in that situation. And I think what ends up happening is like you end up, or at least when I was Scrum Mastering and our PO wasn't involved enough, it kind of started to fall on me to figure out some of this product development road mapping. And I was like, that's again, going back to when I got certified and understanding what a Scrum Master role was, I was like, that's not my job. And it's really about engaging. Yeah, so that's definitely an anecdote or story there. But it's definitely important to engage your PO and constantly feel like they are part of the conversation. Because the more engaged they are, the more invested they are, the more, with it they are to be contributing to your team. So, yeah.
I think we'll take one more. I really like this question. Can you truly be agile if a company has fixed delivery dates and fixed scope? You want to answer it? Or I can...
If you want to take it first, I'll let you take a crack at that first.
If your company has fixed delivery dates. So overall, I'd say yes, because again, agile is a set of principles. And even if you have fixed delivery dates and fixed scope, I think that you can still incorporate some agile principles. So I don't know, that language around truly be agile, if you fully embracing every principle, likely no, just because inherently, it's about iterative development, but you can definitely embody some agile principles still. People and processes over documentation, I think that's correct. Individuals and interactions, that's what it is. And you can embody, the use of Kanban to visually show progress. So yeah, if you have a fixed delivery date, I'd say the main thing you can leverage from Agile is still organizing into individual units of work and utilizing sprints to reach that ultimate, end delivery date. And then fixing scope, that's harder. Because that kind of sounds like requirements are fixed to me.
Yeah, that sounds more waterfallish, I suppose, requirements up front as opposed to ongoing development of requirements.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to, and I again started laughing because I was truly agile, right? What is that? And it goes back to understanding what your company or your project or, whatever situation you're in, trying to figure out what it means to be agile there. And I think by, attending talks like this and getting certified and learning about agile practices in bringing as much of it as possible into your working space, I've seen the benefits of it. But true agile is a tough question, I guess, to answer. But yeah, you can do your best. That's what we can do. We're going to do our best agile is what I'll leave everyone with.
Cool. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for your great questions. This was a really great first event for me personally. I'll speak, and I'll throw it to MK if you have any.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for being here. And yeah, if any further questions, feel free to connect with us. We look forward to connecting with you all, and happy weekend. So enjoy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you all. Bye.